But before I get to that, I just want to say for a moment, in what I'm about to present to you now, this is a composite of the interview data I gathered from speaking to the leading members of the DSM task force, the interviews I conducted with them, and also the archival research I undertook at the American Psychiatric Association in Washington, D.C., where they house all of the DSM documents, the documents pertaining to the construction of DSM, and I've made 2 separate trips to those archives in order to familiarize myself with those documents. But let me just, before I get to that data, first set the scene. So I'll just tell you a brief story. A few years ago, I'm in my office at the University of Roehampton, and it really strikes me, I really need to speak to this guy called Dr. Rόμπερτ Σπίτζερ. So I think, well, look, let me go online, let me find his telephone number. So I search online, and I find this number, and I think, well, I'll give it a call. So I give him a call from my office in London, and this lady answers the phone, and I just kind of assume, rightly or wrongly, I assume that it's his secretary. So I say, oh, hello, my name's Dr. Τζέιμς Ντέιβις, I'm calling from London. I'd love to be able to book an appointment to speak to Professor Rόμπερτ Σπίτζερ at some point. Would that be possible? And then she responds by saying, hold on. Robert? And he goes, what do you want? And I'm like, what? This is not what I expected. And she goes, someone on the phone. And by the way, I'm not going to do any more American accents for the rest of the day. And suddenly, this, hello? Oh, okay, that's just that one, that's it. And it's Rόμπερτ Spitzer. And I say, oh, hi, I'm Τζέιμς Ντέιβις, I'd like to interview you. And so he says, well, what do you want to know? Let's have a conversation now. So I said, well, can I record this? Yeah, fine. So I get my computer and and we have a conversation for an hour, off the cuff. At the end of that conversation, I say to him, listen, Robert, this has been absolutely fascinating. Do you mind if we carry on this conversation? I'll come to the US. Why don't I come to the US and meet you, and we'll carry on this conversation? And he said, fine. Just let me know when, and we'll arrange it. So I go to my head of department, I say, listen, I've got to speak to this guy. Could you fund the trip? And they say, fine, we'll fund the trip. So I head off to the United States 6 months later. So 6 months later, I get on a train from New York City, take the train out through New Jersey to Princeton University. And Rόμπερτ Spitzer now lives in one of those lovely New England homes just northeast of the university. So I get a cab and I head out there, and the cab pulls up outside, and it's this beautiful old home, and it's clear they've chosen a lovely place to live. I walk up to the front door, I knock on the door, and Rόμπερτ Spitzer opens the door. And he's standing there, and he's got this loose sports top on, he's wearing shorts, and he's wearing sandals, and he says, James, coming in. And one of the first things he says is, James, do you want to stay for lunch? And now, I just had one of those mountainous American breakfasts, you know. I thought, oh, no. So I say, yes, that would be nice. And he said, to my great relief, look, before we have lunch, why don't we sit down so I can tell you what you want to know? So I go into his living room, we sit down, I set up my computer, I press record, and off we go. Now, one of the first questions I had for Rόμπερτ Spitzer was this: what was the rationale for this huge expansion of the DSM that happened under your watch? Remember, 80 brand new mental disorders went into that manual. What was the rationale for that? And this is how he responded. The disorders we included weren't really new to the field. They were mainly diagnoses that clinicians used in practice, but which weren't recognized by the DSM. So by including them in the DSM, we gave them professional recognition. So presumably these disorders had been discovered in a biological sense. That's why they were included, right? No, not at all. There are only a handful of mental disorders in the DSM known to have a clear biological cause. These are known as the organic disorders. These are few and far between. So let me get this clear. There are no discovered biological causes for many of the remaining mental disorders in the DSM. It's not for many, it's for any. No biological markers have been identified. And let me just say something here for a moment. Now, the reason why this may sound strange to many people, maybe not necessarily people in this room, but people out there in wider society, is because people expect psychiatry to work much like the rest of modern mainstream medicine. In modern mainstream medicine, and of course there are exceptions to this, but broadly speaking, a name will only be ratified as indicating the existence of a disorder after some kind of pathological roots have been discovered in the body, in the cells, in the tissues, in the organs, etc. But the surprising thing about psychiatry is that it works in completely the opposite way. Psychiatry first names a disorder before any pathological roots have been discovered in the body. So in effect, a new mental disorder can make it into the DSM and become part of our wider culture, even though there is no biological evidence whatsoever to support its inclusion. So I continued. So if there are known biological causes, on what grounds do mental disorders make it into the DSM? What other evidence supports their inclusion? Well, psychiatry has to look for other things, behavioral, psychological. We have other procedures. I then asked him what these procedures were. I guess our general principle was that if a large enough number of clinicians felt that a diagnostic concept was important in their work, then we were likely to add it as a new category. That was essentially it. It became a question of how much consensus there was to recognize and include a particular disorder. So it was agreement that determined what went into the DSM. That was essentially how it went. Right. Another point to make here, agreement does not constitute scientific proof, right? If a group of theologians all get together and agree that God exists, this doesn't prove that God exists. All it proves is that this group of theologians believe it does. So in what sense is DSM committee agreement different? Why, when a group of psychiatrists comes together and agrees upon something, should the rest of us accept they have got it right? Well, the obvious answer to that question would be, well, surely there are other forms of research that are guiding the committee in the agreements they reach, and that would be fair enough. So let me deal with that point now, and let me deal with it by drawing into the conversation a professor of psychology at Harvard Kennedy School, someone called Πόλa Τζέι Κάπλαν. Now, Paul is very interesting because she was a consultant to DSM-III, but more importantly because she lobbied Rόμπερτ Σπίτζερ not to include a new disorder that was proposed for inclusion. This disorder was called self-defeating personality disorder, or SDPD for short.